musicians of Chicago-style Dixieland. Some we will see moving in from New Orleans, and we'll see some familiar names. We'll also see some new people associated with this style. One of the great musicians to become associated with Chicago-style Dixieland and to become not only nationally but also internationally famous is Louis Armstrong. You may remember in our discussion, King Oliver, who was also very popular in Chicago, moved to Chicago after the closing of Storyville in 1922, and shortly after that sends for Louis to come and join his band in Chicago, which Louis Armstrong, who said that he would never leave New Orleans only if King Oliver were the one that requested that he go somewhere else. That would be the only reason, only way that he would leave New Orleans. And so King Oliver did that, requesting that Louis come to Chicago. And he did. And while playing with King Oliver, Louis became more and more famous throughout Chicago. He began to record on his own with a group called the Hot Five and the Hot Seven, and became, by the end of the decade, not just nationally, but as I said, internationally known, with European tours. And so by far, the most important, the most influential of all of the 1920s jazz musicians and on into the 1930s was Louis Armstrong. Another group of musicians became known as the Austin High Gang. It's a group of young white musicians in Chicago that would often make their way into South Chicago to hear King Oliver and Louis Armstrong perform. And many of them attending a high school called Austin High. And this group of young musicians were fascinated with Chicago-style Dixieland. They, or this older New Orleans style that was coming into town, and fascinated with Louis Armstrong and King Oliver and their playing. They would go and listen to these musicians play and come back and try to imitate what they were hearing these older New Orleans musicians do. And in doing so, they created their own version of Dixieland, which is really Chicago style. We talked about some of the differences between Chicago and New Orleans style. And it was really the Austin High Gang that helped to form this newer style of Dixieland by imitating these older New Orleans musicians that had moved into town. Austin High Gang was never the name of a band. It was rather just a sort of collection of these young musicians from the northern part of Chicago who got together and recorded with various bands and on various record labels. I'd like for you to listen to an example of some of the members of the Austin High Gang. You see their names printed there. Gene Krupa, who was a drummer. Eddie Condon was a guitar player. Benny Goodman, a clarinetist, who we'll talk quite a bit about a little later on. Jimmy McPartland was a trumpet player. Frank Teschmacher was a clarinetist. Bud Friedman, saxophonist, and Vic Spiderbeck was a cornetist. And we will also talk about Vic's in just a minute. I'd like for you to listen to a recording made in 1927. It's called Sugar, and Eddie Condon, the guitar player, was the leader of this particular band, and this will give you an idea of what these young white musicians, collectively known as the Austin High Gang, sounded like in their attempts to imitate King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, and others. Bix Beiderbecke was one of the first, I guess, tragedies in jazz. Bix died when he was 29, born in early 1900s and dies in the early 1930s. Bix was kicked out of school because it seemed like all that he was interested in was music. People described him that he used to walk the streets like a dreamer. But when it came to practicing and playing music, Bix was incredible.